Welcome to Wine, Whiskey, and Song, where we explore the connections we make with wine, with whiskey, and with music. Here's Andy Wesley and Tom Rogan.
Welcome back to Wine, Whiskey, and Song. With this episode, similar to what we did last time with wine, we're actually going to talk about tasting whiskey the way that you listen to music. Because again, there's some things that I think that you can equate to the flavors and aromas and textures that you pick up in whiskey and how those relate to music, particularly the intensity. You don't have as much treble in whiskey. Whiskey's much more bass, much more low end, low frequency, a lot more rhythm and bass than you get with white wine in particular, that has a lot more of those higher tone notes, although there are some lemony, grapefruity, honey type aromas in whiskey. The mechanics of tasting whiskey are also a little different than tasting wine because of the amount of alcohol. When we're tasting a wine, you're tasting that somewhere between, call it 7 and 14% alcohol. Whiskey is 40% alcohol. 80 proof would be 40% alcohol or higher. And because of that, you need to create some venting when you're smelling whiskey. And then another difference is it's not really a good idea to put your nose like right down in a whiskey glass the way that you would with wine, because you can burn your nostrils. So we still want to make sure that we're looking at the color of the whiskey, because the color can be an indication of how much time it's spent in oak. Most importantly, with other spirits like rum, color is actually a less accurate indicator of age. And most whiskeys, at least most Scotch whiskeys, you can add some caramel coloring. It's legal to add caramel coloring, so the color is not a complete indication of the age, but the depth of the spirit is important. So we want to make sure that we look at it and get a sense of the texture. And then when you smell whiskey, you want to make sure that you have your mouth open as you're pulling air through your nose to create a little bit of a vent so that the alcohol doesn't burn your olfactory a little bit. So,
and when you say burn, you mean just like overpower it so that it dulls it, so when you go to taste your
there's actually a little bit of burning. One of the things that tasters talk about in terms of when you're trying to identify the amount of alcohol in a wine or spirit, the receptor that you're using is actually a pain receptor on your palate. Alcohol burns. It feels warm on your palate. Like when you put something that's high in alcohol on your mouth, the first thing that happens is your palate warms up. Right? That's a pain receptor, which is actually a burn. So there's a couple of things that we do to avoid that. One of which is when we smell whiskey, we want to do so with our mouth open a little bit. So I'm creating a little bit of a vent there. And then before you taste the spirit, I'm gonna blow some of your minds here, because a lot of you feel that you're somehow showing a lack of courage if you add ice or water to your whiskey. When you're tasting whiskey, before you actually taste it, you should add almost an equal amount of water to the spirit. And I'm going to see if I can actually get this on camera so you can see it. And Tom, if you want to do this along with me with your glass. When I pour the water in this spirit, watch what actually happens to the spirit. See how it clouds up and gets oily?
Yeah.
The water is actually releasing aromas and flavors in that spirit that you wouldn't taste otherwise. It's also lowering the alcohol by volume so that you're going to taste alcohol less and taste the aromas and flavors that we're looking at more. So you will actually get a better impression of the aromas and the flavors of the spirit if you add water before you taste it. It opens up a whole different set of flavors. because there are oils in that spirit that are only released if you add water. So you'll literally taste much more of the aroma and flavor from the spirit if you add a little bit of water. So let's talk a little bit about the things that we're looking for in a quality spirit. When we talked about tasting wine, we talked about BLIC, balance, length, intensity, and complexity. And all four of those things are very important when tasting a spirit, but we're going to add a fifth element, which we call expressiveness. So the acronym for tasting spirits, for identifying the quality of a spirit, is BLICE. BLICE, balance, length, intensity, complexity, and expressiveness. A lot of times the difference between a high quality whiskey and a lower quality whiskey is not the flavors that you taste. You're going to taste butterscotch in very good scotch and in less good scotch. You're going to taste vanilla in very good bourbon and less good bourbon. The difference in quality between spirits a lot of times is the way that they feel, the texture on your palate, and how all of those various components work together. So in a high quality spirit like this Highland Park 18-year-old scotch that we're tasting here, the texture on the palate is really what's going to separate this from lesser single malt scotches. And the way that the all of the components balance together because of that level of expressiveness. Mm-hmm. I've actually heard people talk about the fact that this scotch, Highland Park 18-year-old scotch, is the scotch that is considered by many, the single malt that's considered by many to be the most balanced between the various aromas and flavors that you associate with Scotch whiskey. So let's talk a little bit about those aromas and flavors, because they fall into three different categories. There are certain aromas and flavors in a spirit that are coming from the raw material itself. So when you smell this, you get sort of there's a butterscotch aroma, there's a caramel aroma, like actually, sweet toffee like caramel. Yeah. And there's a barley or sort of a mealy bready note. Mm-hmm. All of those aromas are actually coming from the malted barley itself. So those we would consider to be raw material aromas. Then there are another set of aromas, things like peat or vanilla, or strangely enough, a lot of the fruit aromas that you get from Scotch don't come from the barley, and they don't come from the wood. They come from reactions that are caused during fermentation and distillation, creating what are known as esters. Esters are fruity components. So you might smell a little banana in this, which is a particular type of ester, or a sort of an orange peel aroma that you get from the processing of the raw material. And then the last set of aromas that we're going to find are actually oak and maturation aromas, things like vanilla, which is an indicator of oak, sawdust. A lot of times with single malt scotch, you get a cedary component, which is coming from the wood and the time that the spirit is spending in wood. Mm-hmm. The last aroma that I want to talk about with single malt scotch, and this Highland Park has a balanced level of it, is some of you may have heard of scotches tasting peaty, having an aroma of peat. Peat is actually decayed earth in peat bogs, sorghum and other grasses that get compressed over time underwater in peat bogs. And that decayed earth eventually gets dug up and turned into bricks. And originally in Scotland, they actually used those logs to dry the barley. They don't actually use the logs to create the heat to dry the barley anymore, because they have more efficient ways of creating heat to do that. But they do use peat a lot as a flavoring component to give that smoky, sort of iodine-y, seaweedy, depending on the Scotch. Scotches from Islay the island of Islay, which is off the western coast of Scotland, have a real seaweedy sort of iodine-y flavor component that is coming from that peat. Highland Park uses peat from peat bogs in Orkney, which is the northern islands above Scotland where Highland Park is made. And the peat from Orkney has more of a pure smoky aroma. It doesn't have as much of that sort of pungent iodine-y, seaweedy component, but the smoke that you're smelling here and tasting is actually in essence, a flavoring agent. It's not a raw material, right? The only raw materials that we can use to make single malt scotch, as you may remember from our earlier episode, are malted barley, water, and yeast. But peat is burned in an oven next to the rolling malting machine that dries out the barley, and they suck the smoke through that machine to give it this.
It just infuses it into the barley as it dries.
Yeah.
To get it into the product.
Yeah.
And is there I think I might have caught this on a distillery tour at some point. They may have talked about how long they dry and how much time they infuse that.
Yes.
That peat smoke really varies between a scotch that is not very peaty at all or not very smoky, like a Glenmorangie, tends to be more sweet and less peat, and Lafroig
or Ardbeg or Lagavulin, those scotches on Islay, and peat. The phenols in peat smoke are actually measured in parts per million, and you can measure the amount of peat reek, they call it. That flavor is called peat reek. The amount of peat reek in a single malt scotch. So to your point, something like Lafroig is going to have a lot of peat reek, and really sort of the main flavoring and aroma component of something like Lafroig is the peat itself. Whereas something like this, where you taste peat as a component, but it's balanced with cereal grains and with fruits. I get a lot of sort of like almost like roasted orange peel in this, and there's some toffee and chocolate, and you could literally just go back to this scotch, which has remember we talked about complexity. Complexity is the breadth of flavor and the depth of flavor. And this particular scotch has both an incredible breadth of flavor. There are a lot of different aromas and flavors that you're tasting in a broad range, and also a great depth of flavor. The other thing that I love about this particular scotch, we talked about one of the quality indicators of both wine and spirits is the tail of the song, right? The finish.
Yes.
And this scotch, I'll be tasting this scotch on the way home. It just sort of rings out forever. Like a great song does, and continues to, give you those impressions in your mind.
Yeah. It's this is not something I've really done much, is adding that water to a scotch before I taste, before I drink. And my expectation has always been, well, that's just going to water it down. It's going to have less. It does not. The flavors, the actual complexity of the flavors, you get so much more because it's not being covered up by so much alcohol.
Yeah, I mean, you're literally, it almost turbocharges the scotch rather than muting it.
And suddenly now today I get it.
Yeah. Now, when you drink scotch, you can choose whether to add ice or not add ice. It's your drink at that point. The rules are there ain't no rules. A lot of times in a high-end scotch bar, what they'll do is they'll give you your scotch, and then they'll give you like an eyedropper and a glass of water next to it, so you can add just a little bit of water and get to the flavor components that you're looking for. Because if you have never tried it, take your favorite scotch, take a sip of it, put it down, add an equal amount of water, and then take another sip of it, and you will actually taste more flavor and aroma than you did otherwise, because you've given those aromas and flavors a chance to be released out of the oils in that spirit, and second of all, you've lowered the alcohol. And having said that, if you're concerned that you're putting water in your scotch is somehow going to make you less macho, have a bottle of Everclear next to it, and just chug some Everclear, to prove how courageous you are. But if you want to drink your scotch and drink it and experience it the best possible way, adding a little bit of water is the way to go.
How does that change if you've got something like a cask strength bottle? Because I've had a couple of cask strength bottles of there's a bourbon and a couple of Oban scotches in the past. The one that they sell at the Oban distillery is a cask strength, and it was probably one of my favorite bottles of scotch ever. But I love that punch in the face that you get when you sip that soup, and it is a super hot, intense flavoring, and it's interesting. It seems like that's kind of going in the other direction.
Well, keep in mind that so a cask strength whiskey is bottled directly from the cask. It is not diluted after it's put into the cask. All scotches are diluted before they go into the cask. So one of the things that I thought was interesting when I was in Scotland last year that I hadn't realized before, all Scotch whiskey, when it's put into the barrel, is diluted down to 62.5%, like all of it. 62.5%. Yes. And the reason for that is because in Scotland, there's so much trading of barrels. We talked a little bit about blended whiskeys, blended Scotch whiskeys, which are literally several different single malts blended with a grain whiskey. Or a blended malt whiskey like Monkey Shoulder, which is a blend of different single malts without a grain whiskey. And because they're always trading, they always dilute that barrel down to exactly the same level of strength. What Tom is talking about with a cask strength whiskey is when you are done aging the whiskey, you don't dilute it again down to this is 43% alcohol or to 40% alcohol by volume.
At the end of aging, it might be like in the barrel 50, 49, something like that, and they'll dilute that down specifically to hit that number.
So keep in mind with a cask strength whiskey, even if you add some water to release those oils, it's still considerably higher in ABV than other spirits were. So you're still going to get a bit of that alcohol expression there, and that's the reason for the eyedropper, right? You can determine the amount of water that you want to add in a tasting situation where we're actually looking to evaluate the spirit on objective criterion. We want to dilute the spirit quite a bit because we want to be able to not have the alcohol overpower anything. So with your Oban cask strength, you might add less water, but you'll still see, I'm telling you, if you hold up a glass of whiskey and pour water into it, you will literally see the physical components of the whiskey change. It will cloud up as those oils are released in the spirit, and all of those oils have aromas and flavors in them. So even in that situation, I would say dilute it, maybe dilute it a little bit less. And again, drink your whiskey however you choose to drink your whiskey. But in a tasting situation where we're looking to evaluate things like balance and length and intensity and complexity and expressiveness, we want to add some water so that we can evaluate it properly. Great stuff.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Cheers.
We'll see you again.
The tasting with the mouth open, the venting, I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
It's fun with the difference that makes. That really makes a huge difference.
Yeah, because you're just venting that higher level of alcohol.
Here's Here's a weird one. We went to Caitlin and I went to a hotel in Athlone, Ireland. Athlone.
Yep.
And there were all sorts of activities and stuff going on. One, there was a whiskey tasting night, and I'm like, well, we gotta go to that.
Yeah.
And he had us as we tasted. Take a sip. We didn't dilute. Take a sip. And his theory, and I don't know if this is, some dude's bullshit tours, but he had said, hold it in your mouth for 5 seconds before you swirl it and take. Just let it sit there and let your gums and tongue will draw the alcohol out of the whiskey, then leaving the components you can taste behind. And I was like, well, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So we did that, and it was.
Yeah. No, you're also, what you're actually doing by holding it on your tongue is you're warming the spirit up, which separates some of the alcohol out, because the alcohol will start to volatilize at a lower temperature than the water will. The other thing that I didn't mention with the tasting is a lot of times after the spirit is gone out of your mouth, just pulling some air through and you get different flavors there as well.
I think he was having us do that too. Yeah. Pull it in and then exhale through your nose.
Yep.
I remember that was part of the things. Fascinating. So many different things other than just.
Our song for today's episode is a song by Billy Joe Armstrong and his band Green Day, which, as many of you know, is a sort of harder punk band. And one of their biggest hits, a couple of their biggest hits have been softer ballads, like this one, which is I always sort of get the impression when I listen to this song like it's a high school reunion. And we talked about, a song bringing back a particular moment in time, or a glass of whiskey bringing back a particular moment in time. This song seems to be very much about looking back fondly on memories that maybe weren't that fond when they happened initially. And, sort of realizing that your high school years, taught you some lessons, and that you didn't actually appreciate until later on down the road. And so this is very much a song of remembrance. This is the Green Day song, Good Riddance.
It's something interesting about this song is when we talk about the components of a song, just the chord progression is a very typical chord progression.
Yeah.
You hear this chord progression in like 8,000 songs, but this song in itself is unique due to the ways that this similar chord progression in many songs combined with all the other parts of the song, and the lyrics, and combine in a way that is unlike other songs.
Yeah, it's interesting because this has been in the news recently because Ed Sheeran actually got sued a couple of times, twice, for supposedly they were suing him for plagiarizing basically their song. And to your point, you and I could list off 25 songs that have exactly the same chord progression. This is sort of the standard 3-chord chord progression, certainly through the melody, and a very simple G, C, D chord progression, but each of the songs has its own identity because of what happens with the other components, the rhythm, the melody, the lyrics, etc.
Yeah.
Very interesting. This is Good Riddance.
Another turning point, a fork stuck in the road. Time grabs you by the wrist, directs you where to go. So make the best of this this test and don't ask why. It's not a question but a lesson learned in time. It's something unpredictable, but in the end there's right. I hope you had the time of your life. So take the photographs and still frames in your mind, hanging on a shelf with good friends and good times, tattoos of memories and dead skin on trial. For what it's worth, it was worth it all the while. It's something unpredictable, but in the end there's right. I hope you had the time of your life. It's something unpredictable, but in the end there's right. I hope you had the time of your life. It's something unpredictable, but in the end there's right. I hope you had the time of your life.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with another episode of Wine, Whiskey, and Song. In the meantime, please like the video and leave any comments you have. And of course, subscribe to our channel.